So I'm going to talk about electronic health records and trials. So I've kind of structured the presentation in two main blocks. So the first one is a very, very quick introduction to what electronic health records are. And the second part of the presentation is basically how can electronic health records enhance the trial pipeline. And there's a lot of slides of I told you so, and of course we could have known if we used electronic health records back then. But I think the underlying sort of feeling of this presentation is that this is very much ongoing work. So this is a very rapidly changing field. There have been exemplars. There are many planned exemplars, but they all face significant challenges. And then I'll end with these challenges and what are the different advantages and disadvantages. So electronic health records are essentially data and metadata that get generated during our interactions with the healthcare system. So just like everyday life, when you buy stuff online or you visit a shop, there's a lot of data that gets generated for a variety of purposes, ranging from auditing, billing, or clinical care, that we can conceivably use for research, and increasingly we're doing so. So electronic health records have many flavors. So the primary, I think, and most common flavor is structured records. So these are records that are annotated and recorded using some sort of formal ontology or a dictionary, a finite set of terms. So ICD-10, which you're probably all familiar with, SNOMED CT, that is up and coming, and genomic data that Volkert was talking about, they also follow sort of a common structure on how the data are formatted and annotated. Because you can imagine when you're talking about X million SNPs over X chromosomes, over X studies, unless you have a common format, it's very, very easy to lose track. So these are structured electronic health records. We also have unstructured electronic health records, and these are things that follow some common pattern, such as, for example, hematology results from labs, but that pattern kind of varies between healthcare providers and data sources. So there's some sort of structure, but so-and-so. So structured and semi-structured are by far the easiest types of data to work with. Then we have text. So a lot of information gets stored in text. A lot of vital information gets stored in text. And we know that some clinical conditions have more text than others, such as mental health, for example. So when there are not enough terms from the structured ontologies that I mentioned, things end up in text. And that text is very, very important because it's very, very hard to work with. But information inside the text is actually vital for research. So there are all sorts of methods to parse that and extract clinically meaningful entities. You can have what I call binary data, essentially images. So images from investigative procedures that can have any sort of resolution or granularity that get generated, again, during hospital or during healthcare encounters. And images, of course, come with a text report. That also follows a common pattern, but not really. So text and images kind of go together, like DICOM and these things. And then finally, you have streaming data. So streaming data conventionally in cardiology, I guess, would be things that generate a steady stream of data, like having someone have a Holter for a number of days, an ECG machine, an ETT, or anything like that. But increasingly, I think it also encapsulates things that are the digital trace of our health. So most of us have overpriced watches that generate, that capture our heart rate and record it in sort of formats. So these things are also streaming data, even though getting to the actual data is much, much harder than a conventional vendor. But all of these can be considered sort of potential data sources. You can't see this figure, unfortunately, but it just shows you the breadth and the depth of what's available. And it's a terrible figure, but it's the only figure that exists out there to show that there's a lot of information that gets recorded across these different modalities. So you can have diagnostics, diagnoses, procedures. You can have genetic data, family history, symptoms, etc. And each of these modalities gets recorded in different sources. So you can link all of these to create sort of a unified picture of someone's health status and, more importantly, someone's encounters with the healthcare system for more acute syndromes and diseases. And by the way, so I've put the DOI for every single paper at the bottom left, which you can't see now, but you'll have it at the handouts. Because I've tried, half an hour is a small period of time to put so much information. So there's a lot of stuff for you guys to read later on. Example of electronic health record sources. So this is the figure that went in with the IMI grant, and a lot of people in this room are associated with these data sources. There are a lot of data sources out there. I think electronic health records have been recognized as a potential force to disrupt traditional ways of doing science, with acknowledging their pitfalls. So I think at the moment, probably the biggest resource out there that is planned, doesn't exist, is the Precision Medicine Initiative that Obama announced a couple of years ago, that's aiming to recruit at least 1 million Americans and genotype them and get all the electronic health records and social care and et cetera together. Again, that's the DOI of a review that sort of has more information about these sources. So now we're coming to the main bit. So how can EHR enhance the trial pipeline? So I tried to make my life easier by sort of splitting the pipelines, the trial pipeline as a process. So I've defined some elements of how EHR can help with the design, so the sequel of a trial, when you're trying to design a trial and identify participants, the conduct and the implementation, sort of the prequel to the sequel, so before a trial, during a trial, and after a trial. And I have a few exemplars of each of these elements and EHR data. So this shouldn't come as a surprise. It might, because you can't see the figure, but what this is saying is that protocol complexity in terms of inclusion and exclusion criteria is increasing, and it's increasing very, very rapidly for clinical trials. So these investigators compared trial protocols in 1999 to 2002, and then 2002 to 2006. So the number of exclusion criteria, the median number of inclusion criteria shot up from 10 to 26, and there was like a small increase in exclusion as well. So protocols are getting more complicated. The inclusion and exclusion criteria are getting more complicated, and the more complicated a trial protocol is, arguably the more selective it is, and probably it's more hard to recruit patients for that trial when you have to deal with that. So the idea is that electronic health records can be used as a source of sort of targeted recruiting of individuals. There's a lot of work on, again, using natural language processing, unfortunately, of mapping trial inclusion and exclusion criteria to electronic health record data elements and automatically identifying, be it patients or hospitals or healthcare providers that you could go to recruit patients for your trial. I guess an underlying feature is that you can identify the unmet need for common and rare diseases. So larger numbers and larger scales like the PMI or Caliber or other data sources give you the ability to study more rare conditions or disaggregate conditions that were usually lumped together. So for example, we've done some work recently on hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and it's just because of the large sample size of the underlying denominator population, there were a significant number of cases to study something like that. So you can identify the unmet need, realistic trial population estimates for targeted recruitment, and then equally realistic incident event rate. So when you base your trial recruitment on a pragmatic population, the estimates you get from that pragmatic population are probably more realistic than trying to predict them using conventional ways. And I think that the one bit that I've sort of drilled down a bit more is how do we identify the primary endpoints for trials, and how can EHR help with identifying the primary endpoint of trials. So I think it's fair to say that most trial endpoints are composites, and they're composites because they're composites for a number of reasons. Sample size is one, predictive power is another, but it's very important to select the primary endpoint of a trial, and even more important to make sure that that primary endpoint is going to be targeted by the therapy that's being trialed. So this, a good case study of how this could go wrong is the number of failed phase 3 LDL cholesterol trials. And I think the idea is that even though we know that MI and stroke incidence is going down, and there are other conditions like heart failure and peripheral arterial disease, incidence that goes up. These very, very rarely feature as primary endpoints in trials because for a variety of reasons. But the idea is that if we can include PAD and heart failure as primary endpoints in trials, and we can inform this decision through electronic health records to investigate what the primary sort of presentations of various diseases are, we could potentially avoid late-stage trial failures and probably accelerate the pace of discovering and translating sort of new therapies. And again, this is one of the slides that I meant that this is a I told you so slide. So obviously, in retrospect, everything seems straightforward and easy to do. But this is one example that I could think of that could potentially been addressed through EHR. And this again is more recently a work that we're doing with Harry Hemingway at UCL on disaggregating the initial presentations of cardiovascular disease. This is type 2 diabetes. So the associations are heterogeneous. They range from null to positive to negative. But for example, heart failure and stable angina are chronic sort of diseases that do have a strong association with type 2 diabetes. Yet they very rarely feature as primary endpoints in trials. And I think, again, that there are multiple issues on why that is happening. But using these types of data, you could inform or better inform the design of trials or the sort of the mechanisms that you're trying to check. So this is disaggregating known diseases or diseases that we have a label that makes us feel happy. But equally, as Volkert said, there are many diseases that we call them by one thing, but actually we know that they're very heterogeneous. So heart failure being one example. So moving beyond the traditional stratification of heart failure phenotypes, this is work that we're doing with Tom and Dan at UCL on discovering and validating subtypes of heart failure that don't have a label. So this is looking at that heterogeneity, looking at the heat mapping, identifying clusters of patients using unsupervised machine learning methods, so methods that don't rely on clinicians pointing at things that they think is important, but using all the data, and then, of course, carefully evaluating it. And the idea being that once you do identify these disease subtypes that don't have a label, how do you inform trial designs with regards to endpoints or trial populations, et cetera. And then finally, for trial generalizability, I mean, I think this is one paper that was pretty cool to read on the Ascend heart failure trial, where they compared the patients enrolled in the trial with the patients in a heart failure registry, and they, unsurprisingly, I guess, found that they're not that similar in terms of clinical characteristics. And again, in retrospect, obviously, yes, we knew that, et cetera, but the idea is how can we build methods to actually do that? So how can our trial populations be informed by the underlying data from which we want to draw trial participants? So this is on trial design. So I guess conduct, there have been many more examples, real examples, current examples of how EHR can inform conduct of trials. So execution and drug target validation. Execution, I mean, electronic health records are increasingly being used to recruit individuals. So remember the matching of individuals to trial inclusion and exclusion criteria. This is LEPIS. So this is a system in the UK to recruit individuals from primary care physician visits. So this is a trial called RetroPro on the comparative effectiveness of simvastatin and atorvastatin in patients with primary hypercholesterolemia. The idea is that when a patient visits the GP, they have a consultation and that little box pops up, and the GP at that point can say, I want to recruit this patient, I don't want to recruit this patient, et cetera, et cetera. And if that patient gets recruited, they can get consented on the fly, and you can embed the conduct of a trial within the healthcare system. So this is in primary care. I think that the favorite example of a lot of people, including me, is the trial on thrombus aspiration, where the recruited, consented, and randomized patients for using thrombus aspiration for ST elevation MIs within a registry. So the whole sort of pipeline was conducted within existing infrastructure, within existing clinical integrations and registry. So this had, less than 10,000 patients. And I guess the more aspirational example is what PCORNet and PCORI are doing with the adaptable trial. So they want to recruit at least 20,000 individuals across a network of multiple healthcare providers that are part of PCORI for low versus high dose aspirin for secondary prevention in patients that have had coronary artery disease, that have coronary artery disease. And I think the important thing is with both of these exemplars is that once you do one trial and you get through the hurdles of the information governance, the data elements, it's only going to get easier. And once that trial shows some clinical benefit, it is going to be loved by clinicians and hospital executives, and it is going to be loved by patients. So the idea is that you need these types of exemplars that are very, very targeted and sometimes often get dismissed as too easy to do in order to build the case for more sort of difficult trials and more challenging trials and more non-pragmatic trials to be embedded. So that's the low versus high dose aspirin. Again, so how can we use electronic health records to validate drug targets? So this is sort of one case study of ivabradine on stable coronary artery disease without clinical heart failure. So the Signify trial failed. So lowering the heart rate using this medication in patients with CAD that don't have heart failure does not lead to lower cardiovascular risk. Whereas the SHIFT trial that only included patients with cardiovascular artery disease and heart failure showed a 30% reduction. So I guess the key message is that obviously heart failure is a risk marker, but it might not be causative. So how can we use data that are linked with genomic information and perform Mendelian randomization studies to identify, is the drug target at fault for a late-stage trial file? Is this the right target to begin with? Is it at fault, or is it the endpoint that's at fault? And it's only through combining data from multiple, modalities, it's only then that we can identify patients based on the underlying mechanistic effects of what we're trying to target, rather than go on assumptions that might have been generated using data at smaller scale that were harder to collect and curate, etc. So I guess preliminary studies using EHRs are kind of essential for sort of identifying potential and validating potential drug targets. And finally, the sequel of trials, I guess the implementation, so what happens after the trial. So there's two kind of broad areas that I identify: long-term participant follow-up and what's sort of referred to as real-world evidence. So I guess the best example for long-term participant follow-up is the WASCOP study. And the cool thing is, so what they did is that they followed individuals for 1, 3, 5, I think up to 10 years following the trial with very, very minimal cost by extracting their data from primary care physician entries in Scotland, and they were able to see that the prescribed cholesterol lowering medication did have reduced risk even after the trial had ended. So they were able to find, extrapolate the adherence, how many people were on this drug 5 years after the trial ended, and then look at the event rates of those populations. And this is very, very cool, because the cost of doing this is significantly orders of magnitude lower than having a trial run for 10 years, probably prohibitively, and following individuals. Again, with all the caveats of how do you trust the data that are from outside the trial and all that, but this is, I think, is a really cool example of following individuals long term. And real world evidence, I think you're probably all familiar with this. It's how do we use pragmatic real world data for surveillance. So ENPP is sort of it's a European network of post-marketing surveillance of adverse reactions. So in the UK, for example, and if you look down, so this is the list, if you stratify the search on their website on just electronic health records by country, this is the list that comes. And actually, we have some of these data sets in the IMI project. And it just shows you the power of these data. So what this network does is it summarizes the data, and basically uses it to identify adverse reactions to medications. But I guess the step going forward is how do we identify adverse reactions for people that are on multiple medications and people that are on multiple medications for phenotypes that we might actually just have discovered. So I guess when you look at that entire pipeline, these steps are not isolated, but they kind of follow a flow. So, and I think that to maximize the benefits, you'd probably have to inform each of these stages using electronic health records and methods rather than just one stage on its own. So the last part is a critical appraisal of what I've mentioned. So the advantages of using EHR is larger scale, phenotypic breadth. You can find rare events, less prevalent comorbidities and morbidities. You can use them to refine the primary trial endpoints and select the right endpoints and select the right drug targets and validate them using Mendelian randomization. And post-market surveillance, again, for rare or common adverse reaction effects. I think the underlying to this, there's a lot of, even though there's a lot of work to do, you can embed the trial pipeline within clinical care. And it's only then that you're able to scale, like we saw with Picori and other exemplars. So when the trial is embedded within routine care, data collection is easier, data quality can be more closely monitored, and I think probably recruitment rates will probably go up as well. So, and in a sense, someone said, you know, your electronic health record, our electronic health record, becomes your eCRF that gets sort of passively populated. So the first 30 slides were on how this is fantastic and easy. So the last 5 slides are about all the problems and the challenges. So in the UK, for the RetroPro and the Salford Lung study and all the other pragmatic studies that have been executed, by far the biggest problem, which would not be a surprise, has been around regulatory approval. I guess the ethics is more straightforward, but it's legal and regulatory. And I know for a fact that, for example, during one of the studies using primary care data, every primary care physician, so every GP surgery had to be certified as a trial center and undergo all the paperwork and the approvals that certification entails. So that's very, very challenging. And obviously, again, you need these examples to show that things are actually worth it to do it. Data quality is very, very challenging because these data are not collected for research. So these data are collected for anything but research. So it's for care, clinical care, auditing, reimbursement. So how do you define hard and software endpoints, especially informing what I talked about, primary endpoints in trials? That's a process that would have to be gradually built rather than go directly and have an EHR only primary endpoint for a trial. There are very many biases associated with electronic health record sources, again, because of the different reasons on why the data are collected. And data availability and timing is also very, very hard. And I guess security and patient confidentiality are always there, as with any clinical study, so these are sort of, these are already there. And there's a lot of technical aspects, especially when you scale across multiple providers or multiple centers you have to deal with. So drilling down on some of these, so electronic health records are very, very messy and dirty. And essentially when you want to run your trial, you just want to know who had your primary endpoint or your secondary endpoint, when did they get it, and what was the severity, if you can infer. And the process of going from raw data that is not curated to that nice little house, the nice endpoint, is called phenotyping. And phenotyping takes a long time. So there's a lot of work out there on how do we scale up phenotyping. So this is just one example that we did using atrial fibrillation. So identifying patients that have a diagnosis in primary and secondary care, pretty straightforward using diagnostic codes. But how do you identify patients that have the characteristics of having AF but do not have a formal diagnosis? So they're prescribed drugs for AF. They do not have any other conditions that could have been that they could have these drugs prescribed for, and they have similar mortality or risk patterns. So how do you use these endpoints? How do you validate them in a way that regulatory sort of authorities are happy and then use them in trials. So that's sort of a huge challenge. Data quality, again, the work that we did in the UK comparing non-fatal heart attacks in hospital records for billing, primary care physicians, and an acute myocardial infarction registry, national registry. And surprisingly, so for non-fatal MIs, only 30% are recorded within 2 weeks. So only 30% of events are recorded in all three sources. So your GP should definitely know you've had a heart attack. The hospital should definitely know because they get paid from it. And the heart attack registry, I guess, because it's a non-mandatory registry, you could argue, and we know that it misses some cases, but definitely that 20% between the bottom two circles in the Venn diagram, it just shows you that, and this is just non-fatal MI. So this process would have to be repeated for every single condition that you're looking at. And I guess the idea is that unless you link multiple data sources together, which leads to more information governance and ethics and bureaucracy, etc., you underestimate sort of incidence rates quite a lot. And then finally, EHR data access. So this is just to show that because of the way that data get collected, for example, if I got admitted in the UK for the heart attack today, I would get a bunch of ICD-10 codes and nothing more. So anything with regards to the diagnosis, the treatment, the medication that I was prescribed, and anything else that happens during my hospital visit remains submerged. And this is because the hospitals get paid on ICD-10 codes, and somewhere someone calculated that this code costs X money for the hospital. So this is fine. I mean, if the system works the system works for what it was designed, but it would be really, really cool to have all of this data sort of recorded in a structured way and extracted. But that, unfortunately, is still not happening. So I guess that was all that I had to say. All of what I've mentioned, and more examples with more references are in these two reviews. So the first review is the one that just got accepted last week, that was written on behalf of the consortium. So that is sort of a pretty sort of complete review of all of the things that I mentioned plus more. So you should read it and cite it many times. Thank you.
I have a question on, is it actually clarified who's owning the electronic health records? Is it the patient that is giving the data? Is it the physician who's collecting them? Or is it the society or the insurance company who is paying for this? Or is it kind of, should it be free to everybody? I'm not sure, is this something which is already clarified? And I assume there's also quite heterogeneity in Europe. And then if you consider the whole world, is there some work ongoing?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the honest answer is that nobody knows who owns the data, and that many people think they own the data. I mean, my personal opinion is that the patient owns the data, and it's up for the patient to consent or not consent to the data being used. And I think part of the ethical and the legal challenges with these data sources are around the fact that many different stakeholders assume that they own the data because the data are being stored in their system, and that ranges from healthcare information systems vendors down to physicians. So it's very, very tricky, and I think unless there's a streamlined way to unlock these data for access, all of these things that I mentioned will be very, very hard to implement. So the short answer is, at least in the UK, there is no coherency. There are many data controllers that claim a stake, but unfortunately it's not easy to access the data.
So how would twin studies fit into this map of different methodologies to help out in finding drug targets and
So what do you mean?
I mean, twin studies on twins.
Oh, twin studies. Yes,
yeah.
yes. I mean, I think so again, my opinion is that the way that these data you can maximize the impact of these data is by not focusing on one particular sort of condition, but trying to look at many conditions and at many populations at the same time. And this is something that is increasingly being done by consortia in the US, like the Emerge network, that they try to look at all particular phenotypes in large populations and then validate them and try to repurpose drugs that are known and from other external data sources. So is that really answering your question with twin studies? But I think that it's kind of a fundamental shift on how you would think about performing studies using EHR data. So to scale up the amount of information that you can test at the same time, and I guess integrate the amount of information from other sources. So while electronic health records are sensitive and protected, etc., there's all these bioinformatics resources out there, like Chembl for chemical compounds, and all these sources that have information on what drugs get prescribed for what. So why can't we just cross-reference and then identify potential targets if you have genomic data as well? So it's kind of that thinking that I think is the only way to kind of scale it up.
Yeah, so two questions I have. One is about unsupervised machine learning. Did you have, where you lead the machine, do you have any, or review any results of such unsupervised learning? The other question is like the 31% overlap of the 3 data sets at 2 weeks. Did you analyze longer times to see if the overlap increases?
Okay, so the first question was on supervised machine learning. So we do have some results that Tom, Dan, and myself and Ghazaleh submitted to the AHA, but they're embargoed until then. And I think, but to be honest, this is an ongoing stream of work. So we are due to submit a review of systematic review of papers applying unsupervised machine learning to identify clusters of patients. And most of the studies, I think, have been used on trial populations and have been used on data sources that already have sort of anatomical information and sort of very, very detailed phenotypic information. And what we're trying to do, which is also part of the Big Data at Heart program, is using EHR data to identify clusters through routinely collected data. Because by the time someone has had an investigative procedure, then it's sort of arguably easier to identify what the phenotype is. But can we do the same with comorbidities, diagnoses, symptoms, patterns of medication, etc.? So that's something that is a stream of work that's also in the program. And the second question was about the 30-day overlap. I can't exactly remember. B, even 2 weeks is sort of an arbitrary threshold because of the way that information moves between different healthcare providers. So when you go into hospitals and GP surgeries are not connected in the UK most of the time. So when you go to hospital and you get discharged, your GP gets a paper letter saying Spiros had a heart attack, he's on these drugs, take care of him. So that letter will land on someone at the GP surgery that has to then take it and enter the data. And that might take 1 day, 5 days, 1 month. And when the data do get entered, it might be backdated or it might be, so it's very, very tricky. So the 2 weeks is sort of a threshold that we set as being realistic due to patients going to cardiac rehabilitation sort of sessions. But, I think it's very, very hard to kind of assess.
So if I look at that, I would always refer to that positive predictive value of the code to really capture the disease. I'm not sure if that's the correct terminology, but if I look at that 30%, it kind of reaffirms some of my own bias about electronic health records and kind of the notion of garbage in, garbage out, fear that I know you've thought a lot more about than I have, and I'm sure are very introspective and trying to figure out how to do that. But it still makes me nervous that we're basing so much of our forward-looking or current research on that kind of information. And then if I compile that with all of the kind of feedback we're getting since the Precision Health Initiative about the disparity of doctors having to spend so much time coding and doing bureaucratic data capture, that it's almost like a curse. Like at many educational or many lectures, there's always a joke about the Precision Health Initiative in the U.S. It's like, having the Satan on the stage or something. So I often ask myself, why hasn't that been professionalized? Why isn't this whole kind of onus of data recording not somehow being put in the hands of people who are educated to do it, and why is it still left in the hands of people who are trained to take care of other people instead of maybe capture things electronically? Or am I just not informed about what's happening?
So, small question. So surprisingly, doctors are not trained in clinical terminologies or anything like that. So I think that what the problem you're describing, which is not unique to the PMI or in the UK, is that there's a very completely heterogeneous landscape between the skills of clinicians, the skills of coders, because a lot of the times these data do get coded by people that are trained to do that and not doctors. But that has its own biases.
Because they're trained to make the most profit.
So yes, they're trained to make the most profit, to upcode things or downcode things or whatever, but at the end of the day, they're not there with the patient. So they see a static paper pile and not the actual patient. So that's definitely a problem. So there's no right or wrong, but also it's the electronic health record system. So I think I would say so far electronic health records have been shown to replicate known associations and generate the same signals, but the only way that they would work for scaling up is to do these sort of comparative studies. So run and trial and then shadow it using EHR data and compare, does it actually perform the same, or are we seeing the same sort of rates and stuff? I don't think any technology is ready to just jump in and base everything on it. And especially in the US, there have been many initiatives like the 10 by 10, the AMIA 10 by 10 thing, where they said at least one doctor per ward should have formal training in clinical informatics, which I don't know how that's going. But the idea is that these worlds have started to converge, and they will have to. So it's up to sort of vendors to make life easier, hospitals to make more, etc. So I think it's a very complicated landscape, I guess.
Thank you for this very interesting lecture. I think the data enrichment may be the solution, because if I think of what usually the medical practitioner is doing is this is kind of interpretation. So diagnosis, what we saw as a tip of an iceberg, is a translation from what is the medical condition to medical code. And my question to you is, if you see the trend towards using the source, which is the data itself, let them speak rather than let the doctor interpret it for us.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I think again it's a very complex problem. So up to now, so even for hospitals, for example, ICD is the gold standard, but ICD was created for recording causes of death in medieval England. So the granularity it has already is very, very limited. So that's why now we're all shifting to SNOMED CT, which has a gazillion more codes. But then is what Maureen said, how are doctors expected to sit and pick one of the 350,000 SNOMED terms to record every single symptom and all that? And that piggybacks on that software vendors have to make life somehow easier and more streamlined. So it's a very complex ecosystem, but I definitely agree with what you said, that the raw data are more valuable than the distilled versions, be it for billing, auditing, or whatever. But it's also much, much harder to get at, and much, much harder to to parse. So I guess text is the best example of something that's very, very valuable and is there, and it's known to have a huge impact, but also it's very, very hard to actually extract value from. So I guess it's a solution that requires many stakeholders getting together, which that's why it's very hard.